Hola, buenos dias. So, I'm here to talk about JAMStack. I am Brian, that is my real name. I also am bdougie on GitHub and bdougieO on the Twitter. Everything you didn't know about me is actually in my bio on Twitter, so I'm gonna go ahead and move into the talk. I've got a lot of slides to cover, so I might just go ahead and jump right in, if you guys don't mind. But show of hands, I couldn't see from behind the curtains. Who's heard of the JAMStack? Okay, cool. My job's easy. All right, so now my talk's 10 slides. Just kidding. And also, for the benefit, I'm going to basically summarize Lee's talk in 10 slides because I'm going to talk a little bit about internet history. And I'm going to do it a little different. I'm not going to go do any time travel. But I think the best year of the internet is not 1999, but it's 1996. And it's because of this site right here. So who's ever heard of Space Jam? Okay, cool. Maybe some people are as old as me in the room. Cool. So this is actually a great site because if you go to spacejam.com, it works. The site's really old, but it works today. And the best thing about this is because there's no complication in how you put together HTML and, at this point, a little bit of CSS. And I proved this by actually looking at the source code of this site and putting it on Netlify. So Netlify is a place you can host your code or your static sites. And so I have that Space Jam literally copied on spacejam.netlify.com. So back in the day, all websites were just documents. So you had like a text document, and you could host that using FrontPage, Dreamweaver, whatever your choice was. But the web was simple, and it was nice. And I remember a couple years ago when everybody was complaining about React and the fact you couldn't view source in React because it was using all this crazy JavaScript. And it was like normal for frameworks to do that. I know Webpack and other compilers are kind of assisting us with that now. But the web eventually got a little more complicated. So now we have CSS, or we had CSS back then too as well. And it wasn't as complicated, but not many people really understand CSS. Raise your hand if you understand CSS really well today. How about CSS animations? I still have to go to CSS tricks for that. I just cannot remember how to make stuff spin. Well, the cool thing is there's another site that's also really popular today and still live. It's Craigslist, and it's got a really active user base. So this is actually a screenshot of Craigslist from 2 years ago. The current version of Craigslist has a little more extra CSS, but you get the picture. Today they have like a little more rounded corners, because that's really in today. And this is the CSS for Craigslist here. So, which is pretty cool. I mean, once it's all minified and compiled, and you can kind of see it right there. But that's all the CSS for Craigslist. But the weird part about this is that they still use important, despite the fact that CSS is so simplistic. I just thought that was funny. But moving on from CSS, then we had this thing called JavaScript, and this is what I use a lot of JavaScript too as well. Raise your hand if you use JavaScript. Yeah, apparently it's a thing. I think it's catching on finally. So JavaScript kind of complicated the mix. Like we had this other thing that you can replace JavaScript with PHP, Perl, whatever extra language, dynamic language to use on the web. But we eventually moved on to this. So not only just adding JavaScript, like JavaScript's doing way more than maybe it doesn't need to, or maybe it's doing just enough, who knows? But we had to go into like this world of like the JAMStack, which Lee had mentioned in his talk, so I'm still looking for that Pokemon site built on the JAMStack. I haven't found it yet in my Lycos queries. But so then we had this like Web 2.0 stack, and that was great. It took a lot of the sort of like decision fatigue, and like you just could do like one path to get something done. And then we had this like framework word thing that happened in the late 2000s as well as the early 2010s. And things got really complicated. So my question to you is, how do we get back to this? Like, how can we get back to the point where the web is simple? And with that, I'm actually going to say, let's step into the jam, which is a pun because that's what the song says. Sorry, I shouldn't explain my jokes. But who's ever played this game right here, NBA Jam? Yeah, so I'm a big fan. I'm from Florida. Florida is a state in the US, and we had the Orlando Magic, which at the time of this game coming out, like they were thebomb.com. Don't go to that site, it's not security safe. But NBA Jam. And around this time that this game came out, back in 93, so this came out after the 92, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. So around this era, we had this thing called the Dream Team. Who's familiar with the Dream Team, the original Dream Team from early 90s, 1992? So you got Michael Jordan, you've got Magic Johnson and Larry Bird on the same team, which is like kind of weird. That's like having like Vue and React in the same app. It's just they don't mix. But for whatever reason, it made sense for here. The other cool thing about this is that this team actually played here in Barcelona, and they basically like cleaned the floor with all the other teams. So like the best parts of every single part of the NBA, the National Basketball Association, was on this team. And this is some really cool points to sort of point out. Like the closest game that they had in the entire series was like a 32-point difference. So the best team that actually almost beat them was lost by 32 points. So there's this quote from Stan Lee, which imagine that every issue is someone's first issue. So I'm not going to assume that everybody knows about everything about basketball. So forgive me if I over-explain basketball today, but it's going to get technical. So each basketball score is 2 points. So 2 points, like a 30-point difference, that's a lot. It's a big deal. The one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that this team actually did lose. They lost before they even started the Olympics. They had a scrimmage of a bunch of college players, and these are the college players here. And they were sort of this like trying to filter it out, like they were a team, they were all really good. It's kind of like having 10x engineers on the same team. Like it's not gonna work out. Like you need some junior engineers to sort of make the mix work. And so these guys actually ended up whooping them. And it was because the team didn't know how to play each other. Also, Michael Jordan didn't really play in this game itself. But the one thing to point out, these are all stars in the NBA. So this was the next wave of individuals in the NBA. So we had Chris Webber, we got Penny Hardaway, who played for the Magic, and then also, I just went blank. Oh, Grant Hill. Grant Hill also played for the Magic as well. So I'm looking at his face, I'm like, oh, he looks so different in college. Yeah. So what I'm getting at is that the web, it has evolutions. It's like cycles. It's like cyclical. And there's things that we're doing today that we were doing 20, 30 years ago. Like we had a whole talk about this, so I won't labor the point. But I just want to point out that we have this thing called build tools. And around the time that we were having these framework wars, we had build tools like NPM. Originally was a really cool build tool, Grunt, Gulp, Browserify. They all did this one popular thing, which is basically make the web the way it was in the Space Jam era. So you take your complicated JavaScript framework and you bundle into index.html files. And this was great. This is great today because now we can host our sites in Frankfurt, we can host our sites in Ireland or US West 2, wherever that is, maybe Portland, I'm not sure. But you can host your site anywhere, and it's like the cost of hosting your site wherever you want to go is trivial. It's literally pennies. So the great thing about these build tools is that it compiles down to HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And when you have a build tool, there's this extra step you can do with automation. So if you know that every time you want to merge your stuff to master or you want to push this out to production, you just do a build. So npm run build, Gatsby build, whatever build tool you're looking to do. And I'm really going to be focused on JavaScript because that's my assumption of the audience, as well as that's my background too as well. So replace any sort of build tool with your language of choice. Now, I said I was going to get really technical, so I'm going to talk about basketball. So if you aren't familiar with basketball, it's a framework for sports. So if you're familiar with like football or soccer, it's basically the same thing, except instead of your feet, you use your hands, and everything sort of translates at that point. So that's basketball. And the goal of the game is basically put the ball in the other person's hoop. Okay, does that make sense? We're all good here? And there's this concept of full court layups. So in the NBA, post the whole Michael Jordan era where had very technical basketball and you could just like dunk all the time, it got a little harder because he started, one thing I didn't mention about the Dream Team is the average height of the Dream Team was 6'8". So I'm 6'2 and a half. 6'8 is like a little taller than me. So they were overly advantaged in the height spectrum, and that's what the NBA was for the majority of the early 2000s as well. So then you had these players like Allen Iverson, who some people might know, some people might not know. All you have to know is that he's really good at full court layups. So at the point of him touching the ball when it gets passed in, he takes the ball all the way down to the court and ignores the other 4 people. Raise your hand if you work on a team of people like this. No, don't raise your hand. They might be sitting next to you. So, and like the problem was that like you can't rely on this one person doing all the work. The other thing I want to point out is that you should probably don't work hard, work smart. Or sorry, if you're going to work hard, you should probably work smart. So there's this like line outside the perimeter of the basketball, and outside that line is 3 points, okay? So excuse me if I'm explaining way too much, but again, not everybody's familiar with basketball. So 3 points on the outside of that line, 2 points on the inside of that line. And there's this other concept where There was a book that came out in the mid-2000s called Moneyball, and it was about baseball and applying statistics and algorithms to baseball in order to hire players. And that same sort of statistics was applied to basketball too, and they called it hooponomics. Yeah, it's not the best name, but they found out that at every point of the entire court, there's this one point where you have the highest percentage of shots going in. And they call it Area 31 because 31% of the shots that you shoot from that point of the court, and this is mainly for right-handed players as well. Left-handed, obviously, it's going to be the other side. But at this point, you have the best chance of making shots go in. And with that concept, like, if you're going to do four-court layups, the goal is eventually make it to that point and then shoot the ball. So I'm going to take a break from basketball real quick, and I'm talking about the JAMStack. So a lot of people raise their hands for JAMStack, so this might be a review for some people. But the JAMStack is a term that was coined a bit ago, but it's basically separating JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And really, at the heart of it, it's just explaining the front end. So it's the way that you compile your website, and so you abstract your website from your API or your backend. And to better labor that point, I like to show this picture here. So who's ever seen this? I know we're in Europe, but this is really popular around the time Space Jam was popular. So this is peanut butter and jelly in the same jar. I know, it's madness. And we outlawed this in the States too as well. It took lots of signatures to Congress. But this is horrible. This is like not the way to approach making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I also want to point out that this is not America's favorite. This is not okay. My mom bought this once, and like me and my brothers made sure we never had this in the house again. This is what I like this is what I prefer. I like to have the separation of concerns. So if I'm going to work on front end, and like this is Tuesday, this is front end day, I'm going to build and bundle my front end app, and then I understand that the contract between the API is secure. So all I have to do is just write integration tests. Now, a lot of people will try to think of like separation concerns with, oh, you have two different repos. You're no longer a monorepo. That's really not the case. Like you don't have to go. You can go that far if you want. But essentially, if I'm going to work in the API, I'm working in the API. I want to make sure that contract works. I don't want to bleed the API into my views. And we've had a lot of frameworks, and we had a lot of decisions made with that. And they work for the most part, but they also don't work. Eventually, they get kind of bloated. And the cool thing about this is one thing I did at a company. I don't know if you noticed. I went from grape to strawberry. So I can actually change my front end without concerning the APIs. And I did this at a company where I went from Angular to React. And it took about 4 to 5 weeks to do, but also about 12 weeks to fix it. So within 12 weeks, I was able to switch my entire front end to React, which was great. And I was the only developer working on this problem. The other cool thing is that within the integration framework, you also have this, like you can leverage things like tools like GraphQL, where you can actually talk to your API, make sure you have a schema on your API, and then consume that in your front end. So if my front end happens to be Strawberry or maybe a website, I can also leverage that same API onto a mobile app or onto an IoT device, or et cetera. So having that separation of concerns helps me to sort of understand how I approach this in a new structure. To sort of explain this, I built a site called OpenSauced. That's actually the TLD. It's opensauce.pizza. I was really proud of that. But I had this problem where every time I wanted to do open source work, I would find like cool repos to contribute to, or I'd find an issue that I contribute to, and then I had no time during the week to do it. So by the time I got to the weekend, I would forget exactly what project I was looking at or what repo. And I do work for GitHub, but the idea of GitHub stars are kind of like, they're not real. They exist, but like there's not really a good way to save projects for later. So that's exactly what this project is. It's my CRM or my tool to sort of manage my open source contributions, which it's open sourced as well. It's like open sauce, built on open source. So feel free to check out the repo if you want to contribute with me. But I had this mindset of like when you get lost in the sauce, if you don't got sauce, then you lost. And there's this prophet / rapper called Gucci Mane from the States. It's godfather of trap music. So thank him for all the music you listened to today. And that's where I got the name from. But essentially what I'm getting at is this entire project is built as a React app, built on top of GraphQL, that leverages the GitHub as a backend. So I don't have any backend for my code. I'm leveraging the entire GitHub API as my backend. So any way of searching for repos, saving repos for later, collecting notes, I just sort of mirror an entire repo. So I have a repo that's basically going to be my notes, and my notes are issues, and I interact with like this random private repo. By the way, GitHub gives free private repos for free, so if you want to have a free private repo, I'm just going to mention that because I continue to have conversations with people that don't know that's a thing. But that's the structure, and this is like the JAMStack at its core. Like, I don't have to understand how I'm going to leverage a backend, or if there's a backend existing for me. There's a lot of popular APIs out there, and you just want to tinker with like a Vue or a React or a Svelte or whatever language or framework you're looking to test with. Like, you can test it on the back of something else. The other thing is this company called Netlify. So I used to work for, full disclosure, I used to work for this company, Netlify. And this is the company that I switched from Angular to React on. And they did actually they didn't coin the term JAMStack, but they heavily use it a lot. And it really, at the mindset, is like, if you have a JAMStack site, you can host it on Netlify. And that's the biggest reason why they do it. Rather than going through 10 slides about the NBA and the history of the internet, you can just go ahead and say that. But the best part about this is that Netlify and a lot of other companies are building these pipelines and continuous integration for us. And essentially what it's doing is it's allowing us to work smart and not hard, and by doing through automation. So I used to work at a company where our test suite was a Ruby on Rails app. It took about 40 minutes to run. And like, this is a problem that everybody sort of creeps up into. Like, you just don't see it coming, and then one day you're like, what am I doing with my life? Why am I waiting for these tests to pass? And CI is a way for you to, one, abstract that sort of concern off of your laptop into a CI platform, but two, through like Circle CI has like parallelization, and a lot of other CIs have this. Like, you can improve your test suite by doing some other things and opting into a framework that people have already solved. The other thing about the JAMStack is that it's really built on the whole construct of Git. So I know Ashley was talking about Git in her last talk, and Git is a very complicated thing to teach new programmers. But here we are, we're all learning Git, and so we're all happy. The cool thing about this is as soon as you git push, your CI kicks. So it's whatever, if you're on GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, other platform, your CI traditionally kicks off as soon as you git push up into whatever your remote is. And that's where your CI starts, that's where your process starts, and that's where you should start automating in your thought. So I'd also mention, I work for this company called GitHub Today. Raise your hand if you've heard of GitHub. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to delete the next 10 slides. But yeah, for those who didn't raise your hand, we're a decentralized platform built on an open source protocol called Git. I just made that up. But I really like saying that because people give me a blank face because I'm not as sure of the marketing speak that we should be saying from stage. But at GitHub, we have 40 million developers. I like to call myself a Beyonce advocate, and there's a reason. Because Beyonce is Queen Bee, and since we have 40 million developers, I can be Queen Bee to 40 million developers. So I constantly ask myself, what would they do? And so a lot of people have issues with their CI or issues with the way GitHub works or maybe features they'd like to hear. Hit me up in my DMs, they're open. I don't answer everything, but I answer the good ones. So give me some good responses. I'll open up issue for you internally. And I go to bat for the Hive, too. That's the other thing I like to say. So some of you might remember this, some of you might not. There was a Dear GitHub letter where a bunch of open source maintainers got together and said, hey, this is what is wrong with GitHub, and we'd like this to improve. And this was like pretty eye-opening for GitHub itself. GitHub spent a lot of time working on internal problems as well as external problems, and they kind of lost sight of what their actual community was looking for, and this was eye-opening. As of today, every single issue has been addressed, so all the features that everybody's been excited about seeing since January, or actually late last year, we've actually shipped them. And part of that reason is because of this letter. So you can kind of give yourself a pat on the back if you were part of this, or if not, if you contributed to a project that sort of started this. But we also realize that sometimes life is going to give you lemons. This is sort of an analogy or the saying in the States where life gives you lemons, then listen to Beyonce's Lemonade. But we realize there's some platforms and some things we could do to enable our users. And so we spent, around the time that this letter actually started, we started working on all these things that we call internally primitives. So these are GitHub primitives that we build for sort of building up what you guys see today. And starting with that, I want to talk about workflow automation. So on GitHub, the way we sort of spread the jam is by we enable users to leverage the GitHub API. So GitHub's been around for 11 years, and the GitHub API has been around for 11 years. So as soon as we've had GitHub, like the GitHub API came out. And this is how we've enabled a lot of our partners like Travis and Circle and all these other tools and the integration testing platforms to enable with GitHub because we have an open API for everybody to use. And part of this automation is we built this idea of GitHub apps. We found a way to package up your experience of if you want to integrate on GitHub and you want to leverage the API, there's a lot of things you have to understand. So things like authentication. Now we have this thing called JWT, so like if you don't know about those, then you have to know about those. Then you have webhooks, and then you have to understand like how tokens are being passed and how much permissions are allowed. And that all is like decision fatigue if you want to actually build a small integration to tell you like how many stars your repo has or give you notifications on that. So we built GitHub apps so that way you have like a one in-the-box solution. So if you're familiar with Slack apps, they're very similar in the same sort of construct. We borrowed a lot of ideas from that. And we have this open source platform project called Probot as well. So if you're in the JavaScript or if you know like Create React app, they have Create Probot app. So you can actually do all that from the command line. So you have an interaction with like to be able to build GitHub bots or interactions on our platform today. And where we zoomed out, we sort of found out like, or we sort of thought of like, there are some repeated tasks that we do as engineers every day, repeated tasks that we do every week, every month. And those repeated tasks look a lot like this. So you have the one engineer, or you have the two engineers, or whatever it is, and you want to just put the ball in the hoop. And you have to do that every week, or every Friday, or every Tuesday, or whatever it is. And remind you, like the goal is to get to the best point. So like, if you want to have 100% test coverage, like how do you make sure you're staying at 100% test coverage? And then you could this idea of workflow automation. So this is like my bad attempt at doing a basketball play. So essentially, the person's going to pass the ball, which is out of the norm for the NBA, but we want to pass the ball to the person who's standing at area 31, you shoot the ball, you make a point, everybody wins, you have a hot dog, it's great. So the idea of repeated tasks, so there's this thing that I like to leverage and mention when I give talks, is that when I open a pull request on a Monday, I usually open the pull request, and like the first thing I do is probably the same thing everybody else in the room does. The first thing you do is you go to Slack and you say, hey, my PR is open. Go ahead and look at it. And then Tuesday comes along and you say, hey, my PR is open. Go ahead and look at it. And then Wednesday comes along and you say, PR is open. No one looks at it. Thursday. Friday, you say, never mind, because I'm not shipping on a Friday because I don't trust our test suite. And that whole idea of like repeatedly asking somebody on Slack to say, look at your PR, has been solved by this one developer in Chicago doing pull reminders. And essentially, that whole process of taking your PR and putting it in the Slack and assigning people to it can be automated. This is an idea that other platforms have been doing for a while, but this is like an edge case that GitHub wasn't managing on our own, and we enabled our users to actually build this feature on GitHub themselves. So again, working smart through automation. So a lot of you probably are, raise your hand if you're using CI today on your project. Okay, yeah, more than half of us. I came from a lot of projects up until my last job that were not using CI at all. Like, it was all a manual process. And I know this is like, I work in San Francisco and startups, we should be using the latest and greatest, and like, unfortunately, that's not always the case. But this is like essentially what your CI pipeline looks like. You have the idea of like, you want your test to pass or fail, you want your linting to work, you want to maybe have an idea of a staging environment. That'd be super awesome if you could do that. Sometimes it's a manual process, sometimes it's an automated process, and then eventually you want to push this to production. And you want to also not be able to think about it. Like, one of my biggest things about coming to Europe or going to other places outside of like across the street is like I always have a go bag. So my backpack always has like extra cables, it has cough drops, it has like, I don't know, extra things that I need to know about the trip. And it's because I don't want to make that decision of like, oh man, did I pack socks? Or I don't have a converter. Like, I almost forgot my converter for the US to Europe plugs, and it turns out it was already in my bag. So like, I was stressing the entire time I was on the plane, and then when I got to the hotel, it's like, oh, it's already done. Like, it's here. And like, I have to do that for myself because I do a bit of a traveling for speaking and just attending conferences, so I want to make sure that that's not a problem for me. And sort of like hammering this point home a little bit more is GitHub did this specifically for github.com. So last summer, we actually announced that we got rid of all jQuery on our site. So GitHub's 11 years old. We've been using jQuery for as long as GitHub's been around. And we found out, like, at this point, the JavaScript, so the ESNext and the ECMAScript committee, TC39, they've like pushed a lot of features that you had to leverage jQuery for that are now in native JavaScript. And because we have a lot of like really talented engineers at the company and we want to attract really good talent, we thought, hey, let's stop using jQuery, let's just use JavaScript because everything we're doing in jQuery, we can do in JavaScript. So the way we did this is as part of our build pipeline, we added this lint check. So if you had jQuery in your code or you touched a file that had jQuery, then the bot would actually nicely say, hey, you have jQuery. And the bot would actually present the jQuery code as JavaScript within the PR. So there's no excuse of actually saying, it's going to take too much time to rewrite this. The actual rewritten jQuery would show up right in your PR. And we built this on the backs of another primitive called the checks API. So checks API came around the same time. We were using this internally for a while, and some of our partners were using this. And this is the ability for you to not only provide certain checks on your PR, you can also provide different contexts. So checks API looks like this. Some of you have noticed this, some of you haven't. I know a lot of us use GitHub on the command line, so we never look at github.com. Guilty. But within the PRs, you now have a checks tab. And within the checks tab, if you have enabled GitHub apps or bots, or your team has opted into leveraging this, you can actually see this directly in your PR. And the way to explain this, I didn't build this app, but I built this example of using the checks API on Beyonce's song called Check On It. Anybody a Beyonce fan, or am I just like assuming too much? All right, some believers, okay. Excellent. Members of the Beehive? No? Okay, just one. So Check On It is a song. It's a great song. You probably have never heard of it because it was in the soundtrack of Pink Panther, which is a horrible movie. So you probably didn't see the movie. But Check On It. I just wanted to take those lyrics and apply this app to it. So someone had one of my team members actually built an integration with the open source project called Alex, which basically takes the language in whatever language you're checking, and it uses machine learning to basically say, this language is not okay, this language is good. So it's a great way. There's another bot that leverages this where it notifies you if you're using strong language that may be offensive in your content or code. So I applied this to Beyonce's song, and right off the bat, I already got, within the checks API, I got a notification from Alex saying, hey, you got 4 notifications based on this. Here, you're actually using the word girl, maybe use the word kid instead. So immediately, I got on the email, I emailed Beyonce, and I said, hey, bae, you should probably use kid. I know this is an old song, no one's heard, but you should just go ahead and switch this out. And she didn't respond. It's okay. I'm not upset. But the cool thing about this is a good example to show you that within line of your PR, it'll actually leave comments on exactly what line has a problem. So imagine if your tests don't work, or imagine if you're writing code that uses using single apostrophes or instead of double quotes. Is that a thing? Who's a single quote person? Who's a double quote person? All right. Now look around, and then you guys can fight about something at lunch. Cool. I personally don't care. I want the linter, I want ESLint and standard.js to just tell me what to do. And this is exactly where I'm at with things like verbiage and wording. When I write blog posts and someone has a concern about the words I use, I'm like, oh, cool. Thanks for applying your life experience to my post. I will make sure it's addressed if it makes sense. So the way the checks API works, it looks like this. Pull request is open, checks suite is created, checks suite is then runs. And then within that, it does a bunch of other stuff. So honestly, this kind of looks like CI because it's just doing a bunch of stuff based on your push to GitHub, right? One thing I also want to note is that these slides are repeated, but they're repeated for a reason. You could also enable code to be find and replaced. So if for the example, my jQuery example, if someone is not copying and pasting the jQuery and replacing that with JavaScript, you can actually automatically do that through the bot as well. So this is super powerful, super exciting to use, and I highly recommend you leverage tools like this in your PRs today because they're available to you. The other thing I want to also mention too as far as spreading the jam is security automation. So I'd mentioned earlier about opensauce.pizza, and I wrote a blog post about my experience. I built this app, so I've been at GitHub about 18 months, about 19, 20 months actually, but I built this project before I joined GitHub, and like whenever you start a new job, like all your open source just goes to crap because you're focused on your day job. Well, that's what it's like with me. So I'd like put this project on pause, and when I came back to it a couple months ago, I noticed that a lot of stuff was broken. There was a lot of security vulnerabilities. Who likes the security vulnerabilities on GitHub? You're lying. No, they're great. I mean, but we're going to fix the notification problem really soon, so please stand by. But so I found out that despite the fact that I was a cutting-edge 10x programmer, I was still using Webpack 1 for this project. And if those of you who do not know, like Webpack 4 and like 5 is on the horizon. So I was like, oh man, I really missed that. So I was notified through this tool called Dependabot, and this is what the blog post sort of goes into, letting me know that, hey, by the way, you're using really old code, why don't you update? And the cool thing about this is Dependabot actually adds a PR to your code saying, here's the upgrade. And if you have CI, continuous delivery already built in, you can actually have the confidence of this test. If the test passed and your staging environment is already deployed and then linked, which I use Netlify, so that's linked directly in my PR, I have the confidence of saying, okay, it works, I've QA'd it myself, I can upgrade from Webpack 1 to 4, which is not possible. So it took a lot more work. If you go from 3 to 4 pretty easily, but 1 to 4 is a bit of extra stuff, which I go into in my blog post. But having the peace of mind of having my dependencies like upgraded on a reasonable basis that's pretty much gold for me, because I've been in a lot of projects. I did Rails 3.2 when Rails 5 was out. I've done React, 16 now? This project was actually on one of the earlier 15 versions. And I was able to upgrade all that within one weekend, essentially one evening on Saturday while I was watching Star Trek, because I'm getting really into the next generation right now. But all these primitives they've kind of hit this focal point of this new thing that we've shipped. So who's heard of GitHub Actions? A couple of us. If you haven't, if you don't know, now you know. Okay, that's what I was going to say. But all these primitives have now been sort of like piped into this one idea of a primitive, which is GitHub Actions. And we launched this back in last October, actually, from Stage. And this is actually the biggest feature we've shipped since the pull request. So if you don't know when we shipped the pull request, it was 11 years ago. So we've been shipping features for all then, but this one's the biggest that we've shipped since then. And it's kind of it's kind of changing the mindset of how we're approaching like interacting and doing CI and adding this extra jammy step into our projects. But there are some haters out in the room. There are some haters out on the Twitter. Like, we've all been there. So who's ever heard of Shut Up and Jam? It's a game that no one's played, apparently. Sega Genesis. So Charles Barkley, he's an NBA player. He looks like this. That's him. He was on the Dream Team. He actually had this game that was basically a knockoff of NBA Jam, but not as good. It was like street basketball. And Charles Barkley is pretty famous. He's now an analyst for the NBA, and he's pretty famous for always having like a counterpoint to everything. Like, he's that person in your Twitter feed complaining about the thing that you posted and be like, oh, looks cute, might delete later. And he's like, no, it doesn't look cute. Like, he's that guy. So he popularly had a quote where he was complaining about NBA today. So Hooponomics, he thinks is crap. He doesn't think that you could actually analyze where the best place to shoot. It's all about skill and talent. And he's been proven wrong on this, but I like to point that out because sometimes, like with the idea of JAMStack, when I first started attaching myself to the JAMStack and that whole realm, there was a lot of people who were kind of like, this is exactly what we were doing in 1996. Like, why are you naming this something new? And it's because everybody forgot, so you can have a new name. So going back to Area 31 and this whole idea of basketball, what he was really complaining, Charles Barkley himself was complaining about this guy. So who's ever heard of Steph Curry? So Steph Curry, back in 2015, he kind of had this renaissance within the Warriors basketball. It was actually, they went to the playoffs and won that year as well. And they won by doing something completely different outside the box. Actually, you could also say it was outside the line. So there's an idea, I mentioned earlier, there's an idea of like a three-point shot. So if you shoot outside, you get 3 points. And within that outside line, it's about 23 feet. So instead of shooting from Area 31, which is about 9 feet away from the actual hoop, he's shooting from 23 feet. And the reason why this is not as a popular solution, like we went from the average player shooting about 6 3-pointers a game to now shooting about 30 each game. And it started off the back of this idea, which is if you take that 31% and if you have 2 points, 31% of 2 points is 62 points, or 0.62. So if you take a shot there, the more shots you take there, add those up, and you'll have, if you take 3 shots, you'll have 1.5 points, or the math is off. 1.8 points, basically. But if you take a 3-point and you try 3 of those, though it's 3 attempts, 3 of those is 4.8. All right. My math is correct. Don't test me. All right. But the weird part about this is that Steph Curry was being all weird about this, is that he would shoot from like way out there, like 37 feet out. But why? And the real reason is in the red is because there's no defense out there. So imagine shooting at Area 31 where everybody's standing right there within the paint. You're not only shooting 31%, you're also shooting 31% with hands in your face. But if you shoot from 37 feet, and you're really good at it, and you practice that, then it's going to go in every time. And that's what he was seeing, and that's why the Warriors were beating within that year, 2015, they were beating teams within like 40-point deficits. So we essentially saw a dream team of Warriors basketball, including Steph Curry, a bunch of no-name people that most people haven't really heard of, end up winning the entire championship. It's because they took analytics to their basketball and did that. And take this construct and apply it to programming, and I like to point out this company, Zeit. So Zeit's Now, who's ever used Now? That's the equivalent of shooting a 37-foot jumper. Like, why? What's the point of typing in three characters and then deploying an entire site to production or to staging? Like, you don't really have to make it that easy, but it's really easy. And through that process, like, we were able to take what was normally complicated, what you'd have to like sort of like FTP and SSH into boxes and containers to get a site up and running, or you have to have an entire DevOps engineer on staff. You can now be a small startup and now just type now and deploy an entire site. And the other cool thing about this is that, so 3-pointers, it is like 1.6 points, but if you shoot from this corner, so this oblong line here, it's actually shorter on the sides, and it's actually, in your mind, you think it's a harder shot, but it's actually an easier shot because it's 22 feet away from the hoop. So if you shoot from the side, the other thing is the amount of touch and perfection that takes to shoot. Like, it has to roll off your fingers at a perfect time, and then it just goes in. Like, you know it goes in by the time it leaves your fingers. And it's like, it's this equivalent of, if I hit git push, I should expect these tests to pass because I already have passing tests and only added one thing. And I had one thing with one test. So I should have the confidence that when I hit git push, I don't need to worry about this hitting the rim or getting a rebound. So basketball became, in the mindset of Charles Barkley, it became a lazier problem. And this is exactly what we saw in Hacker News when I started attaching myself to JAMStack, is as soon as we started saying, hey, let's just make it easier. Why don't we make deploy trivial? And people are like, oh, why would I pay for this? It's like, you could do this with FTP. I have a server in my closet, and I could do that easier than using Netlify and signing up and giving up my information. And the cool thing about that with like Zeit and Netlify is like their baseline of making stuff easier is free. And they're doing that on purpose because there's no reason for us to struggle and try to figure out how to like drive to the hoop to make sure we can deploy a site. Like, we did this, flick it off our fingers and make it in. And I couldn't figure out the number, but it was 1.9. So if you shoot from there, instead of 1.62, it's worth 1.9 points. So you won't make all of them, but if you do make most of them, you have a better chance of like winning the game. So I say all this because GitHub, we took a step back and we figured we've been working on this problem for a while of trying to build these primitives to sort of co-locate all this sort of logic and the ideas of automating workflows into one place. And that's why we launched GitHub Actions last year, and that's why just 2 weeks ago we launched GitHub Actions with CI. Because we had GitHub Actions in beta, and we got a lot of feedback and people building CI on top of GitHub Actions. So rather than have everybody else try to drive to the hoop and do the one-person layups and the full-court layups, we now have that enabled for you for free with one click for open source. So read all that stuff on the blog post. The blog post out there. But the important part about this is that all those interactions between webhooks, authentication with JWTs, GitHub tokens, you don't have to think about that. All you have to do is write JavaScript. All you need to know is write Ruby code, Python. Like, any language is valid to write within a GitHub action. So if you build bash scripts to automate processes amongst your teams, or you have a repo, or so you have a script that you build new repos and you have to copy that script to other places, you now can put that in a GitHub action. That GitHub action can float wherever projects go. And this is what it looks like. So if you, now this feature actually isn't beta until November. We'll launch it in November for everybody. If you do want access, find me. I can get you access today if you want. Technically in the afternoon because everybody's sleeping right now in the States. But this is what it looks like. If you have a Node.js project, it will know, hey, looks like you're using JavaScript. You should probably use this one. The other cool thing about this, it also gives you full end-to-end package deployment, registry enablement as well. So if you want to publish to NPM every time you push to master, you now have that enabled as part of your CI. There's no longer do you have to like pass keys around to each person on the team. The keys actually live within the GitHub repo, within a secret, and trusted and secured for you by GitHub. So check that out. And I talked about the CI pipeline, but this is kind of like really taking me a step back because I've done a lot of open source. I've done a lot of projects that inquire like small packages, but I never went that extra hurdle to actually post stuff on NPM or Ruby gems or on pip or anything like that because I always felt like no one's going to use this, and there's way more effort to actually deploy this and maintain that. And the cool thing about this is that that whole idea of how much effort this is going to take is now abstracted away from me, because now at the point that I do merge a release branch into master, I can trigger deploys. I can also trigger deploys to NPM, as well as I can trigger release notes. So there's this GitHub app too that's out there that you can leverage. There's also a GitHub action as well too, depending on what flavor you're looking to get it. But on the right, that's my release notes for open source. So I'd never done release notes because I just never wanted to. I didn't think anybody was going to use this project, but I'm going to start doing release notes because I think the idea of having a bundled version of my site that works gives me the peace of mind. So if anything ever breaks, I can always fall back to it. But I automated my release notes by just using a release drafter, which is just a tool for anybody to use that's open source. One other primitive I'm going to mention too as well, it's this deployments API. It's something that's newer that doesn't get as much love, so I'm about to spread the love as well as the jam right now. So the idea of deployments, we brought the idea of packaging code directly into PRs. We provided checks directly in your code so you can see what happens with the CI. You have this too as well for free with deployments, and we now provide ideas of deployment statuses. So if anybody's using GitHub Pages, you now have this for free if you have a GitHub page site. And it gives you a deployment dashboard. So if you want to see what the previous version of your GitHub page was, you could do that by just going to the dashboard and clicking through. So check that out. But the problem is I use Netlify. I actually don't use GitHub Pages. Don't tell my boss. But I'm a big fan of Netlify. Like, full disclosure, I did mention I did work there, so I just know how to use that platform a little bit better than GitHub Pages. And Netlify actually is a GitHub app. So like their integration with our checks API is already there. The cool thing about this is if you do redirect rules with Netlify, like if you want to switch like a 301 redirect to maybe a blog post is no longer there, you can actually make sure that's permanently moved somewhere else. And you can actually check to see if that redirect actually works through the checks API. That's built in by default if you install Netlify. But I wanted to have deployment logs directly on GitHub from Netlify. And I know Netlify is not really opting into using this API yet. They will soon once they find that I built this, which is Loglify. So Loglify is a GitHub Actions / GitHub app that basically gives me everything that GitHub Pages gives me, but for Netlify. I also built something called, I built this for now as well, but I don't have a slide for this. But you can look at my repos. But I just bring all those deploy logs directly into my repo so I can know when stuff fails. If stuff does fail, I can click through and see the logs directly in there. And that's all the code. It's about like 15 lines of JavaScript code that I have there that's making this work. So if you are using Netlify and you want to use Loglify, it's a hard word. Even in English, it's hard. You can check it out there. So I went through all this. I really want everybody to try GitHub Actions because it's a really awesome way to spread the jam throughout your CI. So there is a lab.github.com course. So lab's our learning lab. It's a place to find like intro to Git and intro to other stuff, as well as some advanced and intermediate stuff. You can learn about GitHub Actions there. You can actually build an action directly in a repo that they create for you. And if you do have GitHub Actions access today, there's like about 538 actions that are currently out as part of our beta program. So there are probably some edge cases or things that you aren't thinking about in your workflow process that you can leverage. And all the code's open source. You can see it. You can contribute back to it. And it's sort of integrating all the stuff that was previously private in our CI YAMLs is now open and public for everybody to benefit from. So I say all this. Sign up for the beta. Find me if you do want to get access. There it is. And then November 13th, check it out. I also want to point out that this underused tool, which is github.community, so if you have problems with Git or you're trying to do something really that does not like leverage in the docs or on Twitter or Stack Overflow, we have a community forum where you can ask questions, and we have a team of a lot of people who will answer them for you. So check that out. I also host a podcast called JAMStack Radio. It is a podcast, and I love it. So if you want to learn more about the JAMStack, if you are uninitiated, episode 2, we go through the history of where the JAMStack came from. And then finally, I just want to say, spread the jam. Thank you.